See in the red.
Okay, well, you're the one who at the control center.
No, not it.
Haven't you been? You're the one who's letting people in.
No,
You
I
did
just
the
put
last
it on
time.
review.
You did the last time. I haven't done anything like that.
I think it's at everything.
Hi.
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 Thanks for.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Last day.
No, who knows how to start this thing?
Well,
Let me log in. Hi.
Did you sort out
Huh?
everything?
No.
Oh, it says it's recording.
It's started yet?
okay.
You
Yes, I'm so
almost
probably
there.
turn it on.
It says I have to go, like, it doesn't open in that link. I think it's specific.
Thumbs up just now. Oh, that's from.
Oh, they
from
turned it on. Yeah.
Inga, yeah.
they recorded.
Is that
You have to
on
unmute.
English? Okay, and there's Dunita and Elizabeth.
You have to read the one.
But thank you for sending that.
I think will be specific to me.
Oh, something happened with my phone. I have no idea. I lost them.
Shall I go ahead and start?
Then
No, don't connect me. Pop it in. Oh, this is good, good.
Okay, okay.
That's good. That's
Well,
Angela's not gonna check.
Pardon?
Angela is not gonna.
oh, okay.
But Profit is here. And that's two.
Well, let's get started.
Yeah.
And so thank you all for your presence during this week. And I once again, thank you to the department and to Elizabeth Guthrie for inviting me here. And this has gone well, I think, and I really feel privileged to be able to be here. And so,
Should thank Terry too.
and thanks to Deary as well. And so today is a somewhat different kind of talk in that it's more contemporary than the previous talks. And I'll be talking today about Cambodian connections to India and Sri Lanka at the present time. And this was actually my original research before I began to shift to my historical work about Cambodian monks in India before 1975. And there are really three related phenomenon here. And in a way, these three phenomenon could each be a study in itself. And this is maybe my putting them together may not always work, but I think there's a point of looking at them as interconnected. And these three phenomena are Cambodian temples in India and Sri Lanka, and Cambodian monks who are in India and Sri Lanka, some as students. And the third is pilgrimage groups. That is to say, Buddhist tourism groups. And so I'm going to start out with a video. Now, the luxury of these talks has been that we have so much time. And this has been good and bad. Perhaps because I've had so much time, I usually when I give talks, I try to condense them. And this time I've had the luxury of going on, and maybe that has been a bit much at times. But so because we have the time, I thought we'd look at this video. And as I told you last time, there are YouTube videos of Cambodian pilgrimage groups going to India and Sri Lanka. There are all sorts of videos of this kind, and I focused on one particular group. There was a series of like more than 10 videos, and it happened that one of the leaders of the group, whose name is Putsavung, was a Cambodian lay Buddhist leader who I was interested in. And so instead of trying to look at every pilgrimage video that's on YouTube, I focused on these. And some of it is rather boring, but there were times when I found it quite dramatic. And so here's a video of Cambodian pilgrimage groups at Kushinaga. Kushinaga is the place where the Buddha passed away, where the Buddha died and entered nirvana. So let's hope that this works. The technical people have been helping me. And this is about 10 minutes, so let's watch the whole thing. Now the group is led by monks. Some of these monks were resident in India, and some of them may have come from Cambodia or from Cambodian temples in Western countries. They're followed by lay women. Most of the participants in these pilgrimage groups, there's usually more women than men. They're often middle-aged to older women, although there are exceptions to that as well. Most of you know this Buddhist flag being placed on the image of
Difference in the Pali pronunciation. They're saying Pali, but they're pronouncing it Khmer.
And at the microphone is Kutsabum.
ព្រះសង្ឃយើងពុទ្ធបរិស័ទយើងមានសេចក្តីតក់ស្លុតរន្ធត់ដោយខំស្រោតធ្វើដំណើរតាំងពីវេសាលីដើម្បីឲ្យបានទាន់នៅព្រះសម្មាសម្ពុទ្ធជាម្ចាស់ទីបំផុតយើងបានមកដល់ឃើញតែរូបសំណាកដែលព្រះអង្គយាងចូលបរិនិព្វានទៅពេលមរជនប្រុសស្រីទាំងឡាយក៏បីជ្រះថ្លាក្នុងព្រះពុទ្ធសាសនាលំអោនមកនៅចិត្តដែលសទ្ធាជឿជាក់លើព្រះធម៌គោរពប្រណិប័តទៅតាមមាគ៌ាដ៏ថ្លៃថ្លាពោលគឺប្រព្រឹត្តទៅតាមព្រះពុទ្ធដំណើរព្រះយុគលបាទទាំងគូរបស់ព្រះអង្គដើម្បីចេញចាកទុក្ខឆ្ពោះទៅកាន់ឋានដ៏សុខស្ងប់គឺព្រះនិព្វានយើងទាំងអស់គ្នាជាពុទ្ធបរិស័ទចងចាំនៅពុទ្ធឱវាទពោលគឺវត្តមានយ៉ាងពិសិដ្ឋរបស់ព្រះសម្មាសម្ពុទ្ធចំនួន45ព្រះវស្សាកន្លងមកគឺទ្រង់បានស្វែងរកសេចក្តីសុខដល់សពសត្វទាំងឡាយនឹងចូល
Donation is an important part of what is going on
ឲ្យ
here.
បានដល់5000ព្រះវស្សាព្រះអង្គទ្រង់ព្យាយាមប្រោសប្រទាននៅធម៌វិសេសទេសនាដែលចាប់ផ្ដើមប្រកាសតាំងពីប្រជជន35ព្រះវស្សារហូតដល់80ព្រះវស្សាគឺលុត្រាណាតែមានពុទ្ធបរិស័ទទាំង4រួមមានភិក្ខុភិក្ខុនីឧបាសកនិងឧបាសិកាគ្រប់គ្រាន់ដែលអាចទ្រទ្រង់ដែលអាចផ្សព្វផ្សាយនៅព្រះពុទ្ធសាសនាជំនួសព្រះអង្គបានទើបព្រះអង្គយាងចូលបរិនិព្វានទ្រង់យាងចូលបរិនិព្វាននៅថ្ងៃអង្គារ15កើតខែវិសាខឆ្នាំអាសាញ់ត្រីស័កពុទ្ធសករាជទី1ជនប្រុសស្រីទាំងឡាយព្រះអង្គទ្រង់បានយាងចូលបរិនិព្វានចោលសពសត្វយើងទៅហើយសល់ឡើយតែសង្វេជយតិស្ថានដែលគួរឲ្យតក់ស្លុតសង្វេជជាពុនពេកក្នុងការដែលព្រះសម្មា
Okay, maybe I think that's the end. Anyway, for some reason of the videos and this YouTube videos, this was a section that was, for some reason, seemed particularly beautiful and moving to me. And the people participating in the ceremony obviously were very much caught up in the experience, and it was an emotional experience for them and an experience of reverence to them. And this is, of course, by no means more Cambodian than it is any other group, that groups from many different countries are coming to India and participating in this kind of ceremony. And in fact, the organizers probably, the Indian organizers are probably in some sense giving an indication of how this ceremony might be performed in ways that are consistent with what other groups were performing. So, okay, let me see. Now the trick is to find my other PowerPoint. Okay, and here's the primary PowerPoint which I'm going to use today. And incidentally, one of our video participants is a Cambodian monk who is in India now. So this should have, he may not want to comment while I'm giving this talk, but so I'm very much aware that what I'm going to present is my own observation and my own interpretation, and there may be other ways of looking at this as well. I was just in India recently for 3 weeks to do research. My research is primarily focused on the things we talked about previously, on the monks who were Cambodian monks who were in India prior to the war, prior to 1975. But inevitably, I spent my time in Cambodian temples. That's where I was primarily staying. And so the kind of things I'm going to talk about today are things that I was experiencing fairly recently. Now, the talk I'm giving today is mostly based on a talk I wrote several years ago, and which was published in Spanish language, and it has not been published in English. And I would like to someday publish this in English, and hopefully and as I go over it, I think that there are a lot of things I would want to not just update, but perhaps rethink and reorganize. But we'll see how that will do. As I give this paper, inevitably I'm going to rely on what I wrote previously, but we'll try to interject some observations where I see things that have changed. And as I say, one reason for including this today is that insofar as I've been trying to talk about texts, that here I'm mostly drawing on my personal observations and on my interviews, but here just to mention that these videos that we saw are also a form of text. And I believe in the case of Anushka, you'll be drawing heavily on social media for your work. And so keep in mind that when we think of text, in the broadest sense, text is not just manuscript texts or books, but it includes things like the video we just saw, which provide their own window, especially into things that are happening at the present time. And one thing I perhaps do not emphasize sufficiently is that the participants themselves are very much involved in videos and social media. In fact, as I've just been traveling in the past 3 weeks, I make new Facebook friends. I see postings relevant to the things I'm interested on Facebook, on other types of social media itself. So this is an ongoing that in the contemporary world, this thing is experienced by me through social media, but it's also experienced by the people, the participants themselves, the monks, the lay persons coming and going from the temples are themselves very much involved in social media, email, various different kinds of texts. And this becomes part of the whole experience that we're talking about. So how does this relate to my earlier talks? Well, obviously, the 2 talks I gave about India prior to 1975, but Cambodian monks in India are related in some way. They're talking about the first talk I gave was on Dharmavara Mahatera, is about sort of one of the first Cambodian monks to be in India. The third talk I gave about the Asia Foundation in India was also about Cambodian monks and other monks in India. These are the people who lay the groundwork for what we're talking about. A few of the Cambodian monks who were in India prior to the war stayed, and they played a role in founding the temples that exist today, as we'll see. So I'm also have been involved in all my work on historical conjunction, moments of historical transition. And so that's another way in which this connects with my previous work. We had 3 papers which were concerned with this moment in history after in the 50s and the 60s, the post-independence period, which also relates to the Cold War, as we said, and which relates as well to the Buddha Jayanti celebrations, which took place in 1956 and 57. The paper last week is also at a historical conjunction. It's a moment of change, the end of the Pol Pot period, when things changed dramatically in Cambodia. And perhaps what we're talking about today is also a continuation of that, but it happens to be things that were primarily taking place after 1990. And what happened in the 90s is that Cambodia, after a period of war and a socialist government in the 1980s, made a transition through a United Nations mission and United Nations sponsored elections to a different kind of political system, a different kind of economic system. And at that moment, the country began to open up to the wider world. And it was in this context that for the first time in many years, Cambodian monks began to feel free to go and study in foreign countries. And that had something to do with what was happening in the kinds of things we're talking about here. Okay, well, I'm going to give my paper proper now. And as I said, we're dealing with these three phenomena. Cambodian monks going to study in the country's pilgrimage tourist groups visiting sacred sites and the building of Cambodian style temples. These pilgrimages, the financial support of student monks and fundraising for temple projects all involve not only Cambodians from Cambodia proper, but the wider diaspora community in Europe, the United States, and Australia. So the transnationalism of the phenomena has its own triangular complexities. Thus, in less than 20 years, now 30 years, we have 12 or more Cambodian temples in India and one in Sri Lanka. And when I first wrote this paper, there were 100 Cambodian monks studying in each country and Cambodian Buddhists traveling in pilgrimage groups several times a year. So in this paper, I'm going to try to see how that happened and what it means in social terms. In an earlier version of this paper, and I still find this idea fascinating, although I wonder if it's changed now. I emphasize the idea of transnational merit making. Merit making in Southeast Asia is a social project and realized in a social context, one which takes on an added dimension when performed across national lines. So I'm going to speak of activities of Cambodians with varying degrees of intensity and purity of intention, pursue religious meaning in a transnational Buddhist context. There are individual stories here, and part of what I want to convey is the drama of individuals negotiating their way in new circumstances. Again, I'm using this word negotiating, which in all of my work, I'm interested in this process of how individual persons sort of find their way, negotiate their way in new circumstances. But I'm principally concerned with a Buddhist setting in which Buddhist communities extend communal practices across national borders, and create new institutions. The pursuit of Buddhist meaning includes the pursuit of education and devotional practices of religious pilgrimage. In some case, it entailed bringing Buddhist relics from Sri Lanka or India back to Cambodia or to Cambodian diaspora temples. This is an aspect which I don't go into detail here, but is actually one of the more interesting things, that the coming and going of pilgrimage also involves relics. Again, the circulation of relics. And it can entail a commitment to establish a symbolic Cambodian Buddhist presence in a foreign country. It is true that whether or not it's always conceived as making, donation and everything that implies in religious social terms figures prominently in these projects. Institutional and personal contribution to monks' educational, personal contributions, enabling other persons to make religious pilgrimage, as well as the fact that in the context of Cambodian Buddhism, pilgrimage invariably involves donation. Specifically, when as it's organized around Katin ceremonies. Most of the people here today know what Katin is. Katin is a ceremony following the rainy season retreats in which monks' robes and other materials are donated to temples. And so some of the pilgrimage groups are organized around a Katin ceremony. Temple building is a project of donation on an even larger scale. The phenomenon of these different ways of pursuing religious meaning as they occur transnationally entails its own set of intensities, complexities, and risks. As we know, border crossing generates consciousness of difference as well as new solidarities. Andrew Walker writes, with reference to very different contexts, and it's on the screen here, connections and flows of goods, information, and people between places are problematic. They generate advantage and disadvantage. They're often the subject of dispute, and they're regularly the subject of intervention. They're an important sphere for the exercise of power. There's an economic dimension to the kind of phenomena we are looking at here. There is an economic calculus factoring into the cost and benefits of determining where and how a monk studies, where pilgrimage groups go, and where temples are built, and differences between economies underlie the flow of people and funds, sometimes enabling religious donation that would not otherwise take place. Increasingly, there are wealthy classes in Cambodia itself, so it is not only the wealth of the Cambodian diaspora that drives these projects, but that's a factor. And one thing I didn't mention in the video is that the pilgrimage group that we watched in the video, it seemed to have been organized by an Australian, a Cambodian couple resident in Australia. And so you had some of the participants in the pilgrimage group were from Australia, but others were coming directly from Cambodia. And so that's part of the dynamic that in the context we're talking about, we see a combination of support and participation from both the Cambodians in Cambodia and Cambodians in Cambodian communities in the United States, Europe, and Australia, probably New Zealand.
Yeah, there are pilgrimages that go from New Zealand,
Yeah.
like in Sri Lanka.
Although my research only touches on it tangentially, I also recognize that government policies for student visas, tourism, and the context under which foreigners can own or manage property are also a significant factor coming into play. Actually, on my most recent visit to India, when I visit these temples, actually, now that I know these monks better, I hear stories about how temples can be owned, what is the process whereby in India, a quote Cambodian Buddhist temple can be instituted with the Indian authorities, and invariably it needs the participant of Indian citizens as well as religious figures who may be of Cambodian origin. And so even the legal framework whereby a Cambodian temple in India can exist can be quite complicated and can change over time. At a more conceptual level, we can speak of, quote, transnational imagination. That is, most of all, a religious imagination which gives symbolic value to some sites as more purely Buddhist. Transnational imagination both transcends and relies on conceptions of nation. The phenomena I look at draw on and contribute to institutions of, quote, international Buddhism and to international Buddhism as a concept. They also, however, underline in some ways refocus understanding of how Buddhism associated with national identity. Thus, for example, for Sri Lankan Buddhists, rescuing Cambodian Buddhism may be related to their own project of Buddhist nationalism. And this gets into complex things, which I'm sure I would like to talk about with Anushka. While at the same time, Cambodian Buddhists in Sri Lanka and India are motivated to rectify the invisibility of Cambodian Buddhism and see it recognized as one of the important Buddhisms of the world. Questions of how Buddhism relates to ethnic and national identity grow even more complex when we take into consideration the role of diaspora Khmer in these processes, that is, Cambodians who have gone to live in foreign countries. Cambodians who are searching for and asserting their identity as Cambodians and as Buddhists in countries of residence where they are a minority. Okay, I'm going to use my published paper and I'm going to talk about the situation in India and Sri Lanka, although I realize that for some of you this is very obvious. These are very obvious things. In Sri Lanka, we find a setting where Theravada Buddhism is the religion of the dominant ethnic group and institutionalized as the country's official religion. It is likewise a country where, because of Buddhist historical role in the opposition to British colonialism, together with the significant presence of populations practicing other religions, there have been particularly strong politicized movements affirming Buddhism as a religion. It is a country with an active tradition of Buddhist missionary work in foreign countries, of a sort that has never significantly developed in, for example, Cambodia. This relates in terms to openness to foreign Buddhist monks studying in Sri Lanka. Although a small number of Cambodian monks studied in Sri Lanka prior to 1975, there is no continuity between these monks and the newer waves of student monks. Instead, Cambodian monks began going to Sri Lanka in the 1990s because of the interest of powerful Sri Lankan Buddhist monks and Buddhist intellectuals with prior connection to Cambodia. In contrast, in India, which is, of course, the historical birthplace of Buddhism, Buddhism is, from the perspective of the country as a whole, fairly peripheral, although it has undergone revival since at least the 1950s among certain segments of the population. It is in part the institutions arising in the context of that revival and the Indian state's willingness for them to exist, which provide the context for Cambodian monks currently going to study in India. Whereas Sri Lanka has a tradition of Buddhist missionary work, India has been at different times and places the object of Buddhist missionary work by Sri Lankans as well as others. This is one factor in the presence of foreign Buddhist temples at sites associated with the life of the Buddha, which have also been developed as pilgrimage sites for foreign Buddhists. While being misleading to call Cambodian Buddhist missionaries to India, the presence of Cambodian monks and pilgrims relates to this larger phenomenon, a Buddhist pilgrimage and missionization from other countries. Khmer monks began going to India for study as early as the 1950s, as we saw in our previous talk. At about the same time that monks and laypersons were encouraged to visit India in the context of the 1956 Buddha Jayanti celebrations, and the fact that a handful of Khmer monks and ex-monks were still in India after the Pol Pot period and into the 90s provides a significant continuity for Cambodian Buddhists who began to go to India since the 1990s. Well, here I have some maps, and I think probably everybody here knows where these countries are. But you can see, well, I think we all know where Sri Lanka is. But in the case of India, perhaps it's significant to point out that the areas we're talking about are in the sites of sacred the sacred sites of Buddhism. So they're in the northeast of India, primarily in the provinces of the states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And there's also a Cambodian temple in New Delhi. Okay, I'm going to start by talking about Cambodian monks going to Sri Lanka in the 1990s. Cambodian monks began going to Sri Lanka with Sri Lankan sponsorship at the time of the 1993 UN mission to Cambodia. And I said that in the that Pol Pot period was from 1975 to 1979. And then during the 80s, as we saw to a degree in the lecture yesterday, was a period of, it was a socialist government. It had strong ties to Vietnam. It was called the People's Republic of Kampuchea. And there was a resistance movement on the border at the same time, all of which played itself out in relationship to different ideas about Buddhism. In the early 90s, there was a peace agreement between the resistant groups on the border and the Phnom Penh government. And this resulted in a UN mission in where the peace agreement was signed in 1991, October 1991, and the UN mission was in 1992 and 93. So we're talking about transformations that took place in Cambodia in the context of a United Nations mission. It was in the context of negotiating leading up to the mission that Cambodian state policies toward Buddhism liberalized in 1989, following several years of tighter socialist controls. And as we talked about ordination, after 1979, for most of the 80s, the only legal monks were men over 50 years old, although in remote areas, there continued to be many younger men who ordained as monks. So it was what was legal and what was actually happening in practice were two different things. But in 1989, the law began to change, and younger Cambodian men could once again ordain as monks under certain circumstances. Large numbers ordained, many going to Phnom Penh in newly reopened Buddhist schools. A British-educated Sri Lankan scholar of Buddhism, Hema Gunatilake, was a conspicuous presence in Cambodia at this time. We see her picture in the upper left-hand corner. What?
Just looking at it.
Yes.
Ben goes.
She and her husband have been very conspicuous intellectuals in the country. Hema Gunatilake worked first for the United Nations, later for the Heinrich Böll Foundation. She actively promoted Cambodian Buddhist institutions, including the newly revived Buddhist Institute and the Association of Nuns and Lay Women. She's closely identified with the first groups of Cambodian monks going to Sri Lanka, having organized an examination to choose candidates in coordination with the Ministry of Religion. Although a Sri Lankan economist, and I did not know this for a while, working in Cambodia for the Asian Development Bank, Raja Korali, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing names correct. And you see Raja Korali in the left, in the picture on the lower left corner. He should be mentioned for also having brought two small groups of Buddhist monks to Sri Lanka and installed them in the famous Gangaramaya temple in Colombo, the first arriving a few weeks before the first monks organized by Hema Gunati Laki. Hema Gunati Laki describes her role as, quote, facilitating the sponsorship of Cambodian monks by Sri Lankan monks. A first group selected on the basis of an exam administered by the Ministry of Religion was sponsored by Venerable Mapalagama Vilpusara, who's another name that Anushka doubtly knows better than I do. And you see his picture in the center. A second group of primarily younger monks 2 years later was divided into 3 sites at provincial temples. And a third group of 4 monks in 1999 accompanied Venerable Omalpi Sobitatero, who we see in the right-hand picture, when he returned from Cambodia to his temple at Ambelipitia. The Sri Lankan monks and intellectuals involved in bringing the early monks to Sri Lanka are each in their own way larger-than-life figures with multifaceted careers. Their sponsorships stem from a concern for the future of Cambodian Buddhism as it related more generally to their profound devotion to Buddhism, a devotion which in the case of Hema Gunati Laki and Venerable Omalpi Sobidatero has included a controversial element of Buddhist nationalism. Of the Sri Lankan temples housing the first Cambodian monks, the 3 I've been able to visit are extremely different in style and orientation from each other. The spectacular Gangaramaya temple, a common tourist destination in the heart of Colombo, the more austere but historically important Parma Dhammachai in the suburbs of Colombia, and the more distant Bodhiraja Viharaya temple of Venerable Omalpi Sobitatero in the mountain town of Ambelipitia, with programs, environmental and social outreach. What they have in common is strong international links, including active programs of missionization. They also have in common the leadership of particularly strong monks. Venerable Podi Hamuduruno of Gangaramaya Temple is one of the highest profile monks in the country. Again, this is an article I wrote several years ago. I do not know the current status of most of these monks. Venerable Mapalagama Vilpusara, a colorful, somewhat eccentric figure, was in his lifetime perhaps best known in Sri Lanka as an artist monk, but also held high positions in several international Buddhist organizations. He visited Cambodia in the 1960s and again in the early 1980s when Cambodia was recovering from the Pol Pot period, a visit probably connected to his prominence in an organization called the Asian Buddhist Council for Peace, a Buddhist organization based in Mongolia, which stressed the participation of Buddhists from socialist countries. I believe, although I haven't been able to prove it, that the September 1979 ordination ceremony, which we talked about yesterday, was that this organization, the Asian Buddhist Council for Peace, played a role in bringing together the monks who were involved in that ceremony. Although this is something that seems to make sense given who was involved, although I have not been able to prove that. Venerable Omalpe Sobitatero, one of the founders of the Jatika Sangha Semelanaya, again, I apologize for my pronunciation, is a political party made up of monks, and I think this is still the case, but was the case when I visited Sri Lanka, one of the most visible of politically active monks in Sri Lanka. He worked for the United Nations Cambodia in the late 1990s on a project in cooperation with the Cambodian Ministry of Environment. He is also the founder of a Buddhist association in Singapore. The early projects to bring Cambodian monks to the country with Sri Lankan sponsorship was by no means ran smoothly. I can recall when I first met Hema Gunatilake in the early 2000s, before I was doing this kind of research, I remember expressing some disappointment in conversation. And some of the monks and ex-monks interviewed for this study were frank in calling these programs. They even used the word a failure. And less than half the monks actually completed degrees, and most ended up leaving the monkhood, with many now having little to do with Buddhism. Nevertheless, you have to balance this with the fact that there were also some dramatic successes. And again, things have changed since I wrote this paper, but 4 of the monks at the time I wrote this paper were, and 2 of them had already become laymen. A third one has also become a layman in a rather dramatic case. Were professors at the Preah Sihanouk Raja Buddhist University in Cambodia. The one, and I don't know how much to go into detail about this. These are monks who are people I know, who in this case, I would almost use the word friend. The one who was the rector of the Buddhist University and the vice rector, and then after achieving a very high rank in Buddhism, recently left the monkhood in something that has very much been discussed in Cambodia. And he still has a very prominent role in Cambodian affairs. Another one who completed his doctorate in Cambodia, when I first wrote this paper, was his deputy. He did postdoctoral work at Harvard, and now he has the role that his colleague had as vice rector of the Buddhist University, and also now has the title of Samdai. At least one other former monk from the group is a high-ranking official in the Ministry of Religion. Another who completed an MA in Sri Lankan is, when I did this research, was an administrator at a private university. And this is to say that as I do this, as I meet Cambodian monks and laypersons studied in foreign universities, we have to recognize that it's simply difficult to be a foreign student studying in any university. And these early programs were rocky. Not everybody succeeded, but some succeeded very well. While in Sri Lanka, there's expectation that monks will ordain for life, the percentage of the early student monks who've stayed in the monkhood after studying Sri Lanka is probably higher than the Cambodian average for those staying in the monkhood. And the early sponsorship of monks was also successful to the degree that it created a groundwork for subsequent waves of monks going to study. These early Sri Lankan sponsored monks came when Cambodia was emerging from isolation with minimum international experience and relatively low levels of education in English. There was no early generation of Cambodian student monks to show them the ropes. Coming from a country emerging from war and political isolation, they were completely dependent on their sponsors. They faced cultural shock, including difficulty adjusting to the highly spiced Sri Lankan foods in situations where they had no control over their diet. One of the first to return to Cambodia complained of stomach problems caused by this. And I don't want to laugh about this, but actually, this is a theme that comes up again and again of Cambodian monks, and perhaps lay people who go to Sri Lanka and India to study. They have trouble with the spicy food. Or Cambodian food can be spicy as well, but it's spicy in different ways. One monk went so far to say that the monks and all the temples had problems with their sponsoring abbots. This is no doubt related to the fact that the monks in their 20s were typically expected to study at the elementary level of much younger monks. While they blanched at doing this, they were regarded as undisciplined or uncooperative. It may be true that some monks came to Sri Lanka more motivated to study English and obtain university degrees than to pursue a religious vocation. However, it's also true that some who removed themselves from the authority of their sponsors were among those able to achieve the greatest levels of success. When Hema Gunatilake brought a second group of 10 monks to Sri Lanka in 1996, the selection process was partially made of Sri Lankan monks she recently brought to teach in Cambodia. Perhaps to address some of the problems that had arisen with the earlier group, that they selected younger monks, only one a bhikkhu, and of the novices, one 17 years old and the rest 15 years old or younger. They were sent to 3 different provincial towns. This group also had dramatic failures, within the most disastrous case some child monks fleeing their temples and making their way to Colombo, eventually returning to Cambodia. The strategy of bringing child monks did have some successes, though. Two of the child monks who came at this time, another very young monk who came later as part of the group sponsored by Venerable Omalpi Sobidatero, stayed in Sri Lanka. They were still there when I originally wrote this article. Integrated fully into the culture, learned Sinhalese well enough to study in Sinhalese medium schools, and completed advanced degrees. One who was became quite close to Venerable Omalpi Sobidatero is now back in Cambodia teaching meditation primarily to Westerners who are in Cambodia at a very prominent meditation center. With older monks, a significant point of tension was that they were required to study for long periods in the Pirivena system, that is the traditional seminary-like education for young monks, and did not see any path opening up to proceed to the university system. Many of the first monks never got beyond this stage before returning to Cambodia, even though, as the English teacher to several of the monks told me, those who managed to enter the university all succeeded. 3 monks, 2 from Paramadama Chetya and 1 from Bodhiraja Viharaya, took the drastic step of breaking with their sponsoring abbot, returning to Cambodia, and then returning to Sri Lanka on their own. And this phrase "on their own" is what I use in this article. And another a Cambodian scholar who's worked on the issue of Cambodian monks in India has used the word self-finance. And so there's a difference in that there are monks who go with a sponsor, the Sri Lankan or Indian government, and then there are those who find their own funding to go on their own initiative. And so when I say on their own, that's what I'm talking about. And actually these who left and came back with their own financing, with their own arranging their own strategy of study, these were the most successful monks. When these monks returned to Sri Lanka, they brought other monks with them who also came to study on their own, in effect ushering a new wave of Cambodian monks going to Sri Lanka without any Sri Lankan sponsorship. Where the phrase "on their own" or self-finance is used by monks and former monks in Sri Lanka, it indicates there's no institutional sponsorship from Sri Lanka or elsewhere, and neither the Cambodian Ministry of Religion or any other authoritative body was involved in selection. It does not necessarily mean they came without financial support. An increasing number of monks came as it becomes harder and harder to make generalizations. Some came with family support, some had accumulated enough from donations to purchase airfare, some had the support of their home temples in Cambodia, some found individual Cambodians from Cambodia, from overseas Cambodian communities who were willing to support them. Thus, new kinds of transnational donation began coming to the fore. practical economics entered in, as well as the fact that at a certain point, donation for monks' overseas education began to capture the imagination of donors. This had occurred at a time when Cambodia was opening up to the world in a more general way in an economic logic of capitalism with aid, and aid was kicking in. At the same time, diaspora Khmer began to have more connections with their home country than in the socialist period. It also corresponds to the time when Cambodians began to go on their own to India. By this time, Cambodian monks would have had somewhat higher levels of Buddhist education in English. This also facilitated the transition. Once they arrived in Sri Lanka, monks found places to reside and prepared themselves to take examination for entry into universities. They found it relatively easy for monks to get Sri Lankan visas to study. One former monk even said that once the price of airfare was covered, it was cheaper to study as a monk in Sri Lanka than in Cambodia, especially for monks studying at the Buddhist and Pali University, which reduced the regular tuition for Cambodians. And I'm going to skip over some things. There's a section here about the creation of an association, and I'm going to skip over this. Although monks going on their own continues to the present time, and I haven't been back to Sri Lanka in quite a while, but although I do follow the Cambodian temple on their Facebook page, I believe that this pattern continues to the present time, although institutional funding materialized again in 2007 with scholarship provided by a Khmer Buddhist education assistant project called KEEP. KEEP is a small NGO begun in the 1990s in the camps on the Thai-Cambodian border, primarily the project of one man, Peter Gyalipop. Gyalipop has been able to give modest scholarships to Cambodians studying at the Buddhist University of Phnom Penh. In 2007, it obtained co-funding with the Kyetse Foundation, a foundation typically more oriented to Tibetan Buddhism, to provide a small number of scholarships for Cambodian monks studying at the MA and doctoral levels in Sri Lanka. There were 6 recipients at the time I visited Sri Lanka in 2014. Recipients are chosen by the staff at the Buddhist University in Phnom Penh and commit themselves to teaching there for a time after completing degrees. It has proved successful in enabling advanced studies for a number of talented monks, some who had completed BAs at the Buddhist University in Phnom Penh, some who studied previously in Burma, and some who had first gone to Sri Lanka on their own and were successful enough academically continuing a program of this kind. One of the most successful scholar recipients, Venerable Lun Lai, who completed a doctorate in Sanskrit, went to Sri Lanka as a teenager in a second group of students organized by Hema Gunatilake. I believe there may have been at least 2 or 3 Cambodians who've completed in doctorates in Sri Lanka. Okay. Oh, well, here's just, which I should have shown you early, here's some of the issues that we talked about before. Adjustment to foods, culture, what monks perceive as authoritarian in Sri Lankan temple, some tensions having to do with the fact that Cambodian monks, who were grown men, were made to study with Sri Lankan novices who were still children. And perhaps in an attempt to resolve these problems, later Cambodian monks chosen to go to Sri Lanka were younger and placed in temples further away from the city with mixed results. Again, this whole issue of monks going on their own, self-finance, what did that mean? And it was a sort of transformation, and for a while was in both Sri Lanka and India was an important pattern. In India, this seems to be decreasing in recent years. So now we'll talk about India. And in India, and this relates in part to things we've been talking about in previous sessions. In India, the pattern of monks going to study is much more deeply linked to pilgrimage and temple building than it has been in Sri Lanka. Again, these are three separate phenomena: student monks, Cambodian pilgrimage groups to sacred sites, and the building of Cambodian-style temples in India. Each have their own dynamics, sometimes totally unrelated. But in practice, they are often linked and typically share a common momentum. The current wave of Cambodian monks going for study in India began somewhat later than in Sri Lanka in 1998, but because there are more explicit links to what happened before the Pol Pot period, the history, in a sense, goes back further. The story of Cambodian monks who went to India prior to 1975 is itself an intriguing topic, which I've talked about a bit in my previous lecture. For the purpose of the study, four figures stand out. Venerable Mahaprasad Ekapanyo, often referred to simply as Venerable Prasad, Venerable Moksa Paul, Dr. Sambe, and Mr. Kelpama. Venerable Prasad is perhaps the single most important figure. It's the monk who you see on the left. Having never left the monkhood and having founded two temples, I think he came up before in our discussion because when he first went to India, he was identified more as a Thai monk. He had gone to Bangkok from Battambang, Western Cambodia, as a novice in the 1930s. I believe actually he, by the time he went, he was actually a bhikkhu and was based at Wat Po before going to India in 1956, in part to study, but also as part of a Buddhist missionization project, or perhaps as a pilgrim. On this most recent trip to India, I did ask, why did he go? Why did he go in 1956? And actually, people said they didn't quite know. He had a Thai passport in the early years when he was there. The first temple that he founded at Sravasti, sometimes pronounced Savati, which was consecrated in 1988. The building of it began early, was originally considered Thai and relied heavily for its religious support from contribution made by the lay community of Wat Po and Bangkok. It was only near the time of his death in the late 1990s that it began to assume an identity as Khmer. It is still commonly used by Thai pilgrimage groups. The New Delhi temple was created in 1994 at the site of a former medical clinic in Mehrauli, within walking distance of the Ashoka mission that we talked about earlier. Venerable Prasad had obtained a diplomatic passport from Cambodia in 1993. And the temple was more clearly from its inception, anyway, from very early on. I was told that the temple in New Delhi also had a lot of Thai funding, and the decision to make it Cambodian, well, it occurred before the Sima ceremony was put in place. But there was a certain point where, in a somewhat controversial way, he publicly announced that it would be considered a Cambodian temple. Venerable Prasad, who died in 2002, had a higher level of Buddhist education than many of the Cambodian monks who came later. He's said to have a level 4 in the Pali exams in Thailand. But nevertheless, he was known for the intensity of his forest meditation and supernatural, quote, supernatural capacities said to achieve while meditating in the Himalayas in the 1960s. I was told that on this most recent trip that he practiced yoga as well as Buddhist meditation. He was very, very interesting, unusual monk. He's often remembered as a magic monk, such as in his effectiveness in conferring power by Srautuk, by water blessing. This may be one of the reasons he was successful in generating funds for his temple. Khelpama and Dr. Sambe have been closely connected over the years. Now, Khelpama is the second person there, and actually he's, of these four people, he's the only one who's still alive. And I made a trip to visit him, and he's in a rather remote area of India in Sravasti, and it was not that easy to get there and interview him, but I interviewed him 5 years earlier, and it was very interesting, and I feel lucky that I was able to interview him again on this trip. And Dr. Sambe was alive on my first 2 visits to India, but now he has passed away. Khelpama well, he had a political background. I don't know if we need to go into this. He had left the monkhood in 1967. 1970, there was a coup in Cambodia. Sihanouk fell, but Khelpama identified with Sihanouk and his organization based in China, and for a while received a salary from the movement in support of Sihanouk based in China. Sambe was one of the group of Cambodian monks at Pune University at the time that Cambodia fell to the Khmer Rouge in 1975. All these monks who were studying in Pune left the monkhood in order to go to the US as refugees, but Sambe, perhaps because of his own political philosophies, which were somewhat consistent with those of Khelpama, decided to stay in India, in part so he could finish his doctorate, in part because his sympathies were more with the opposition to the United States. Both Khelpama and Sambe had United Nations refugee status, both had periods of residency at the Ashoka Mission, and both worked for periods of time in the American Library in New Delhi. Khelpama would eventually become the Mahaprasud's manager of the Temple Sravasti, and Sambe, and now he manages that temple after Mahaprasud's death, and Sambe would be the manager of the New Delhi temple. He also led tour groups to Buddhist sites since the 1980s. A fourth figure, Moksa Paul, was a similar liminal figure in the years after 1975. He left the monkhood at the end of his life. He became monk again. I think I'll skip over this. But the current wave of Cambodian monks going to India began in 1988 when a Cambodian monk based in France, Venerable Tut Surit, brought 2 monks to India in the name of revived Dhammachai, that is to say, Dhamma Mission Association. Venerable Q Samang became, in effect, an assistant to Venerable Prasad at the New Delhi temple, perhaps already anticipating his death 4 years later. Venerable Sampit had also been designated for the New Delhi temple, but he was advised that he could better pursue his education at the Nalanda Pali Institute, that is to say, Navanalanda Mahavihara, which we talked about. An older Cambodian monk, Venerable Putong Hao, had become a disciple of the meditation master Goenka. While living as a refugee in the United States, he made regular trips to Western India since the mid-1980s. 2 younger monks from Cambodia accompanied him in 1980, learned while in India the possibility of studying at Navanalanda Mahavihara, and ended up staying. One was Venerable Pol Pot, who we see in the picture on the right here. On the left, there's Dr. Sampet, and in the picture, there's Q Samang and Pol Pot. He and Venerable Sampet, who eventually completed a doctorate at Sampurnan Sanskrit University in Varanasi, currently represent the two most active focal points of Cambodia temple building in India. Each in its own way is a complex gatekeeper bridging Cambodia, India, and the Cambodian diaspora communities. The number of Cambodian monks in India continue to grow. And this is complex because things have changed since I originally wrote this. At the time I wrote this, there were, again, this pattern of Cambodians monks going on their own, that is to say, with sponsorship from individuals in Cambodia or the diaspora community, or support from their home temples, or sometimes support through these figures, Pui Meta and Dr. Simon Pei. This seems to have changed, and the momentum of monks getting sponsorship from Cambodia diaspora community seems to have decreased, although the number of scholarships from the Indian government has increased. And so there's been a shift in there, but there are large numbers of Cambodian monks and also Cambodian lay persons studying at different levels of bachelor's degree, master's degree, or doctor's degree in India. At the time of my first visit to India, the greatest concentrations of Cambodian monks were at Banaras Hindu University and at Magad University near Bodh at Banaras Hindu University in 2014, there were some 20 student monks, enough that the university gave them a separate building for residents near the international hostel. However, this has decreased, and now there are only 2 Cambodian monks studying at Banaras Hindu University, both with Indian government scholarships. So I don't pretend to have a clear map, except to say there were different patterns of funding, and now it seems like many of the monks who are going to India at the present time are going with government of India scholarships. And the Indian government is encouraging Buddhist studies in India. And the government of India, more than other countries, someone said that as a monk, he would have liked to go to China, perhaps, but China does not accept monks for scholarships to study in China, whereas the Indian government is open to that possibility. So there's a complex relationship of what is possible and how it's changed over time. And here we'll talk about the Cambodian temples. If we count the temple at Shavasti, there are 12 Cambodian temples in India and Nepal in various stages of completion. This at the time of I was doing my research. I haven't counted recently, and it's complicated because some temple projects exist as projects, but do not really have much in the way of activities. And there are some new temples, but this has also been complicated by the pandemic and some of the internal politics of these organizations. The fluorescence of Cambodian temples relates to increasing numbers of Cambodians in pilgrimage tourism group visiting sacred sites. It also reflects the fact that Buddhist temples from many other countries exist already at these sites. David Geary writes, efforts were made under the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the President, Rajendra Prasad to reconcile religious differences and promote India as, quote, the homeland of Eastern religion and stimulate pilgrimage from neighboring Buddhist countries. A pivotal event in this mid-century nationalist context was the celebration of the 2500 Buddha Jayanti held in 1956 to commemorate the birth, enlightenment, and parinirvana of the great Indian Tathagata. This is something we've looked at previously. With large numbers of international dignitaries in attendance, Nehru invited the neighboring Buddhist governments to establish their own respective religious institutions, Bodh Gaya. So building on this historical foundation, there is now a particularly intensive concentration of foreign Buddhist temples at Bodh Gaya and active promotion of Buddhist tourism by the Indian government. International Buddhist presence now extends to other sacred sites. While one factor in the building of Cambodian temples in India may be to provide temples for Cambodian monks studying there and occasionally to serve the Cambodian diplomatic community, the more important motivation for building them is to meet the needs for accommodation for pilgrimage groups from Cambodia and other Buddhist countries. More subjectively, given the large numbers of Buddhist countries and philosophies represented at sacred sites, temples are built as a way of affirming Cambodia's place among the Buddhist nations of the world. Purely in terms of their institutional underpinnings, the Cambodian temples divide into two groups, and this is controversial. One includes those incorporated under the name of the Indo-Khmer Theravada Buddhist Society, an organization led by Venerable Prasad, Gyalpa Dr. Sambe, and Mr. Vinod Tiwari, including temples at Delhi, Sarnath, and Rajagir, and Kosambi and Shavasti. The other group consists of those incorporated by the Cambodian Monastery Trust, headed by Moksa Paul, with Venerable Poi Meta as the executive director, including temples at Bodh Gaya, Vaishali, Kushinagara, Lumpini, a second temple at Rajagir, and one at Unvelatkam. The fact that Sambe and Moksa Paul had Indian citizenship was important when these societies were originally created. The two temple building associations do not represent different schools of Cambodian Buddhism or any particular difference philosophically, but they do represent different styles and networks of loyalty, which may at times surface as tensions. Dr. Sambe, joking in English, played on the fact that Venerable Pei Meta's name, Metta, refers to a Buddhist concept often translated as loving kindness. And he equipped that, well, there's the Metta group and the non-Metta group. The Indo-Khmer Theravada Buddhist Society temples seem to be more loosely allied. They include, and this has changed somewhat. The one temple in Kosambi is now directly under the administration of Samped. Although Samped may be a force behind the other temples in this group, different temples seem to have raised funds on their own and taken their own separate direction from different abbots. The temples of this group are smaller but more likely to have the central Pravuhia building and are more likely to give the impression of being close to completion. Although receiving pilgrimage, which is a central activity, these temples do not seem to be directly involved in organizing pilgrimage groups coming to India. In contrast, the Poi Meta temples are all clearly part of a single project. They're bigger and more ambitious in the sense that they relate to a grand scheme of bringing pilgrimage groups regularly to India. The Poi Meta temples are all similar in architectural style, either a long, thin building or an L-shaped building with either 2 or 3 stories, and multiple rooms looking out toward the plaza with Khmer decorations, but looking, as one Western observed, said, much like a hotel. They're also, in my observation, and this was 10 years ago, much less likely to be done. I think this is still the case. Some of these temples are still have not been completed, although some of them have been completed that were still being worked on when I first went to India. Venerable Poi Meta's organization this was before the pandemic, brought groups of pilgrim tourists twice a year, and the temples are also used for pilgrimage groups from other countries. Anyway, this gets here's an example of the Metta temples on the left as opposed to the non-Metta temples on the right. And again, this has changed that there are new Metta temples since I originally wrote this paper, and things have been remodeled, things have been changed in what I'm calling the non-Metta temples as well. Venerable Pol Pot has had complex problems with the Indian government. He was, because of disputes with local authorities, I understand he was not allowed to go to India for a while. Now he seems to be going back to India. He also had disputes with Cambodian authorities. I'm not going to go into the details of this because it gets too complicated and I could easily make a mistake. Pol Pot is the more controversial character. And frankly, I was asking myself, what is happening to his temples? Because for a while he could not even go to India. And but when I was in India this year, what I learned was that somehow, despite everything, his temples seem to be have continued to be built, have continued to survive through the pandemic into the present day, and perhaps in their own way are flourishing. But this gets into things that it's hard for me as an outsider to evaluate. And these temples have their own dynamics. They face the crisis of the pandemic, in which for a period of time, obviously, there were no pilgrimage groups going to India. And yet now the pilgrimage groups are beginning to go again. I think both groups of temples, they do rely on Cambodian pilgrimage groups, but in order to survive, they have pilgrimage groups from other countries, particularly Thailand. Thailand has a lot of Buddhist pilgrimage groups going to, and Saim Pet, for example, speaks Thai because he lived in a Thai monastery for a while. They speak multiple languages, which is they're really quite, both Saim Pet and Pol Pot are in many ways very remarkable figures who have managed to have a complex multicultural identity, which in itself is quite interesting. Well, let's go on quickly, and to the pilgrimage group, and Sri Lanka is also a significant destination. Well, maybe I'll just use the notes on the PowerPoint. Prior to the pandemic, Pol Pot brought at least 2 groups a year, one at Katan time with 300 people, and one in mid-February with 250 people. Reports are that pilgrimage groups are going to India once again, although it's not clear whether they are sponsored by Pol Pot's organization. As I said, this gets complicated because pilgrims are often donors or become donors. And so the fact of these pilgrimage groups, and they also relate to the students, because the students, the monks, if you're a monk studying in Sri Lanka or India, then when these pilgrimage groups comes, they often, especially if it's during a vacation period, then the monks will accompany the groups and also receive donations from the pilgrimage groups. And so they receive financial support, and there's the possibility that these monks will develop a personal relationship with members of the pilgrimage groups who will then go on to continue to sponsor them in some ways. And they also, the pilgrimage groups develop a relationship to the temples, and they may continue to contribute to the temples after they've returned from the pilgrimage groups. And the pilgrims support Cambodian temples because it will make pilgrimage more easy in the future, but also because they want to see Cambodia clearly present as one of the Buddhist nations represented at sacred sites. There's a nationalist aspect to this. There's this feeling that by contributing these temples, they see, if you go to Bodh Gaya, there are temples from Tibet, China, Japan, Thailand, Burma, and Cambodians who go as pilgrims want to see a Cambodian temple because they want to say our type of Buddhism deserves, has a place among the Buddhisms of the world. And so this becomes part of the dynamic of this whole process. So anyway, of course, there are the most famous pilgrimage sites, Bikini, Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, Kuchinaga, and then, but there's a whole series of other pilgrimage sites at Varanasi, at Kosambi, at Sravasti, where each one has a history of supporting temples in various Buddhist traditions. There's also a Cambodian temple in Sri Lanka, and so let's talk about that quickly. While Sri Lanka is also a significant destination for Cambodian Buddhist pilgrims group, it is less common and took longer to develop. It was also longer before there were attempts to build a Khmer temple. As in the case of India, the Cambodian lay Dhamma teacher Butsavung and his disciples have influenced the direction of development, if only because Butsavung's 3 trips to Sri Lanka together with pilgrimage groups set the stage for other kinds of group tours and funding. 5 monks from Wat Goltatung, one of the temples closely identified with Butsavung, would go to study in Sri Lanka. While this number is relatively small, some of these monks have been influential, including one who was the president of the Association of Cambodian Monks in Sri Lanka, and 2 who have played a major role in the temple building project. As we have seen, the recent history of Cambodian monks in Sri Lanka has been characterized by their difficulty in finding appropriate housing and ambivalence about accommodating to powerful Sri Lankan monks. It was Cambodian pilgrims who had been to India who encouraged the Sri Lankan monks to build a temple. Some initial attempts were made to locate a site at Anuradhapura, but that came to nothing. Anuradhapura is a major temple site. Initial explorations about temple building took place in the framework of the Cambodian Student Monks Association in Sri Lanka, but when that did not seem to be leading anywhere, a group of monks who were not officers in the association pushed forward to act independently. This would result in tensions, perhaps the marginalization of the former leadership of the association. The fact that 2 of the monks involved in the new project were previously connected with Butsavung may have given them useful fundraising connections. Another key monk was one of the first child monks come to Sri Lanka who successfully acquired Sinhalese language and was very much in the ambit of his original sponsor, Venerable Omalpi Sobidatero, his preceptor for bhikkhu ordination. The connection to Sobita with his strong political links to the Sri Lankan government proved to be invaluable. The monks emphasized that a balance of skills among the 3 of them made the project possible. The monks made use of land donated trust to Venerable Omalpi Sobidatero by an elderly woman, a retired school teacher who remained a significant presence at the temple until her death in 2016. An agreement was signed in October 2010. Some monks moved into the house that was on the property, and work began on a Anakoti, Ana residence for monks. This occurred in India. Cambodian artisans were brought to do the work in Khmer style. Although the site is remote from universities where the monks study, it has been successful as a focal point for the Cambodian monks, and it works well as a residence for monks studying the postgraduate level who do not have to attend classes daily. The temple has enough rooms to provide accommodation for Cambodian pilgrims visiting Sri Lanka, but this has so far been secondary to the function of providing residence for monks. And I believe that there's the Cambodian temple in Sri Lanka is largely completed now. It was still very much in a building stage when the two times I visited. I think I'm going to end at that. Here's another video, and just to end with this is a shorter video, and then we'll end with that. And I hope we can have some discussion about this. Let's see if this works. It seems more affiliated with Buddhist or note that the way they dress was color coordinated. This was, the Pygmalion groups had very high quality video productions, and they printed booklets, sort of souvenir booklets commemorating what they'd done during the pilgrimage. The lay leader, his name Kelly Wood, we were trying to remember his name the other day.
ពពនហសម័យជាថ្ងៃដ៏មានអ្នកខត្តរឹកបំផុតពុទ្ធបរិស័ទទាំងអស់បានចំណាយនៅកម្លាំងកាយដ៏ក្រៃលែងណាស់ឡើងមកកាន់ភ្នំនេះក្នុងវេលាពេលព្រឹកពុទ្ធបរិស័ទទាំងអស់ទទួលនៅអាកាសធាតុដ៏ត្រជាក់ល្មមនឹករលឹកគូជាទីជ្រះថ្លា
Okay, I think that's it. And I have here again is a picture of the Cambodian temple in Sri Lanka. Here was the plans for it, and you can see, I think these might have been pictures I took myself when I was there when the building was still very much ongoing. It's now, from pictures I've seen on Facebook, they may still plan more building, but it looks very much like a temple at the present time. And the opening ceremony was the International Buddhist Center took place in November 2013, and the president of Sri Lanka was present.
They had a big sign, welcome.
Yes, and of course, now he's no longer in power, and I don't claim to understand the political situation there. I've heard that that the monk who at this time was closely identified with him ended up opposing him as well. Again, I don't dare have any opinion about Sri Lankan politics, which are quite complicated. Some important figures came from Cambodia, including a very prominent lay woman figure, Nyek Bun Tha. There were messages of greetings from religious and political figures from Sri Lanka and Cambodia, including some of the highest ranking Cambodian monks, Samdet Omlam Heng, Butsavung, this lay leader who's been very influential in Cambodia. Venerable Amalpate Sabita Tera in his speech talks about his distress over the state of Buddhism in Cambodia. And there was also a Sema ceremony for the Cambodian temple affiliated with Sampet on February 28, 2014. 24 titled monks were present, and altogether 75 monks. Again, Samdet Omlim Heng, quite an important Cambodian ranking monk who perhaps may eventually become the Mahanikat Patriarch. He took the central role of cutting the twine for the central Sima stone. Groups came from Battambang, Siem Reap, and Kampong Cham in Cambodia. And again, the figure Nyek Bantha, a lay female Buddhist leader, attended. She's been, at one point, she played a very prominent role in the support of these foreign temples. There was mention of unresolved zoning problems, and well, these are sort of out of date, but my PowerPoint, which I prepared some time ago, I included a picture of a prominent senior monk who's based in Canada, receiving a doctorate at Delhi University in 2004. There have been since been other monks and ex-monks who received their doctorate in India. And below, there's a Cambodian monk receiving a master's degree in Sri Lanka in 2015. Well, there have also been Cambodian monks who've received doctorates in Sri Lanka since then. And to close, well, to relate this to my previous talks, actually my original plan when I went to India was that there was going to be a ceremony honoring Dhammachai Mahatera, the monk I talked about in my first lecture. And he had died 25 years ago. And there have been sometimes ceremonies honoring him on his birthday, which is February 12th. And I made my plans to go to India with the idea that I'd attend that. And then for various reasons, they changed the date of the ceremony, and I left before the ceremony, which is fine. I was able to visit the temple. Well, one person sent me some photos. One of these pictures, the one on the right, is something someone sent me. The others are pictures that were posted on Facebook. I think among the group of monks attending, I believe, is Mom Savon, who is one of our video participants. And but anyway, this just to show, and here present are probably all the Cambodian monks who are currently in the New Delhi area, and many of the Cambodian lay students who are studying in New Delhi at the present time, as well as representatives of Cambodian embassy and other people who had historically had a connection with Dhammachai Mahatera in the past. So again, this relates to some extent to my talk today, but it also connects us to the story, the history of Dhammachai Mahatera, which we started out with on our first lecture. So, okay, so I'll conclude with that and open it up to comments and questions. And and of course, as always, I'm very interested in the comments of the Cambodians who are here by video, but also Anushka, who knows about Sri Lankan Buddhism, and but anyone. And as always, I'm a non-Cambodian, not Indian or Sri Lankan either, and so I'm very much open to the comments of people who know about these things more from the inside than I do.
I guess one thing that interests me, like people have been making pilgrimages to these Buddhist sites for more than 2,500 years, right? So it's probably not that different, you know. And I just find it really poignant that they want to take their own food with them. That they can't eat Sri Lankan food, and like I was talking, the bus with the pilgrims had they brought their own food with them and, you know.
Well, I was
Yeah.
telling Elizabeth about my experiences traveling in India, and at one point, I was staying at Cambodian temples, and I'd written this article, which published in Spanish, and I've been looking at this topic for several years. But this time, by luck or by accident, I was in Varanasi, and I wanted to go to Rajagir. And the abbot of the temple in Varanasi said there's a pilgrimage group that will be going by bus from Varanasi to Bodh Gaya. And he said that if I'm into Bodh Gaya, it would be much cheaper for me to go from there to Rajagir. And so I rode the bus with the pilgrimage group, and I end up, they stayed in a hotel in Bodh Gaya. I end up staying at the same hotel. And so, well, some of the things I observed, I knew already because I studied these videos of the pilgrimage groups. But as I was telling, one thing that I was more aware of is that, and also was aware of from staying at these Cambodian temples. And when I was staying at these Cambodian temples, the pilgrimage groups would come, stay at the temple while they were visiting sacred sites in Varanasi or Sarnath or Sravasti, and then so I could see how it worked. And the way it works is that these say a group from Cambodia will bring cooks from Cambodia, and and so if you're with these groups, you know, in many ways it's very hard for these groups. I think when I look at that video we saw today, I think these people, they were experiencing a very intense devotional experience, but it's possible they were also very tired from having been on this pilgrimage group for some time. And so this is not an easy trip for the participants, but they do have cooks. And my experience is the food was very, very good. And so they're not eating Indian food, they're eating Cambodian food, which is prepared by cooks who are brought from their home country. And that becomes, that's an important cultural thing at these groups. So
Because Sri Lankan pilgrim groups who are going to India, they're
Yeah.
doing the same thing.
Yes.
They're even bringing this coconuts, like the whole coconuts with them. No, this is true. I
So the
used
water
to
is
like
safe.
interview
Yeah.
some of them.
They want safe water, right?
I have no
Coconut.
like coconut, scrape coconuts so they can cook because they have two cooks and then
Okay.
they can scrape coconut.
So breaded coconut,
Yeah.
wow.
So they're not getting any Indian kind of interaction or cultural experience in a way, because in Bodh Gaya also you can talk to people in Sinhala. The beggars would call you in Sinhala, like talk to you in Sinhala.
Yeah.
So it's really
Yeah, they're not
different.
adventure tourists, they're
It's not. It's
pilgrim.
yeah, they're
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
Jambudvipa basically, not to India. It's like
Yeah, they're going to jump into Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
yeah.
That's why it's an emotional experience. That's why it's.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that as I said, I have these two articles. The one is written, it's only been published in Spanish, and the other one, which was in your reading packet, is, well, it's based on my experiences in India and Sri Lanka and with interviews, but it basically draws on what I was able to learn from these videos. And that is specifically focused on the pilgrimage issues, but there's a lot to be said about these things. And actually there is a scholar in the United States who works primarily with Cambodians in Long Beach, California, and her research has been mostly with the diaspora community, not so much in Cambodia itself. And at one point, she announced that she was going to go on one of these pilgrimage groups but in the end, for various reasons, it might have been about the time of the pandemic, she did not go. And so, but in terms of an anthropological research project, it would be quite interesting to participate in one of these these pilgrimage groups.
So I worked like in some interviews for one
Yeah.
of my professors in India. So I had to like go to this one of the pilgrims groups and then interview them.
Yes,
So I also have had the chance to like eat with them, which is
Yes.
really good.
yes,
And then there's like some regulations in Sri Lanka, so you can't operate throughout the year
yeah,
because some of the months will be so cold in those places.
yes,
Sri Lankans are not used to it.
yes.
But anyways, they are doing it. So
Yeah.
I think some people have died in some of the cold weather.
Really, are you talking about in India or Sri Lanka itself?
Sri Lankan pilgrims
In
Going,
India.
to India.
yeah, because,
Yeah,
Yes.
John said he was about ready to freeze.
no, the first time, well,
He got this
the
message like,
first, actually, the
I don't
first time
think
I
I'll
went to
ever do
India,
that.
actually, Elizabeth and I went at the same time and it was very hot. And
It's a
we were
hot
so
season.
ignorant, we did not realize there's some months you do not travel in India.
Yeah.
But because we had air conditioned car, it actually turned out okay. It turned out that year was not quite as hot as sometimes it gets. And then the second time I went in December and India can be really, really cold.
Yeah, it is cold. It's really cold, and they don't have a heating system.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, just
Like I know he was saying, I can't wait till I get to New Zealand because it's so cold here. And I said, well, actually, I think the temperature is the same.
Well, actually, I was
Dunedin.
checking the temperature as I was traveling, and on my phone, I had the temperature in the places I was in India and the temperature in Dunedin, and it was often about the same. Yes.
But at least there's a heater
But,
in New Zealand.
and, but actually, but because I was staying in Cambodian temples, and the Cambodians who are listening video, the Cambodian temples are very nice to me. I'm very grateful. And they, in one place I had hot water, and other places they would even boil water so I could take a hot bath, and that did make a big difference. And so if you are someplace where the people who are hosting you, in this case, I was staying in Cambodian temples, that they know what to do, and they are concerned for your welfare. It was okay. It was, and yeah.
so
And-
this Cambodian temple in Sri Lanka, like it opened in 2013, right? Like they have opened it.
What do I have
Oh,
here?
It was older.
It was when it started earlier,
But they
but
had
they had the opening ceremony in 2013.
13.
I have the dates. The dates are in the article, and they had gotten the money from, not the land, from an elderly woman who was still alive
Sri
the
Lanka.
first times I visited there, and it was her property, and she wanted to donate it to this famous monk, Omalpi Sobidatera, and and ultimately the territory, the land, the property was in a trust, and ultimately he controlled it, the monk, and a Sri Lankan monk, and if he chose to take it away, he probably could have, but everyone was devoted to this project of building the temple, and the Sri Lankans did not know quite how to take it. People said that the neighborhood people said, "Oh, but this is a Mahayana temple," and because it was different from a Sri Lankan temple, and they said, "Well, no, this is another kind of Theravada temple." And actually, once I was on a tricycle. I was trying to get to the temple, and they were asking directions from. We were close to the temple, and we asked the people oh, is the Cambodian temple near there? They said, oh, you mean the Thai temple? So even in Sri Lanka, there was a tendency to identify it not as Cambodian, but as Thai somehow. So, and this is the kind of thing that, of course, the Cambodians are not happy about at all. They said, this is a Cambodian temple. So,
But Sri Lanka was in like a very different moment at that point because we had like 2009, there was like war victory
right,
over
yeah,
Tamils, and there was like this huge project of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism and building nation and Buddhist revivalism, and then there was this Myanmar monk Asin Viratu who came to Sri Lanka, and they had like a huge 10,000 attendee ceremony or something, and then yeah, because of that, I think Sri Lanka also wanted to be like a center of Buddhist world, maybe.
They always
So
have.
they have for a long
yeah,
time.
long time.
And yes, that when I was there, it was after the war with the Tamils had ended, and then there were tensions arising with Buddhist Muslim issues, and we don't need to go into that. But and as you, of course, and I don't pretend to understand the situation, but of course, the politics in relationship to religion continue to be very complicated in Sri Lanka, as I'm sure you could tell us much better than I can. So
Because Sobita Thero was like
Yeah.
one of the strong part of that movement in India.
Yes.
So he was one of the first monks who sat on parliament.
right.
So he like, so they were in Jatika Helodumaya, which is
Yeah.
like formed by like faction of Buddhist nationalist, and then only monks were appointed as parliamentary members through this party. And they one of the things they were trying, like the first things they wanted to do is like stop like forceful conversions, which were not forceful conversions, it's just like converting to other religions or something. But
Yes, yes.
they were in this Rajpaksha, so with all of them were in like one huge section. So
Yeah. And when I went to Sri Lanka, I wasn't looking for political things at all. I just thought this is a very non-controversial thing. Cambodian monks studied in Sri Lanka, and then I found out that things got complicated fast. And as you know that, well, my interaction with Venerable Omalpi Sobidatera were quite positive. I will say that my contact with him and what people told me about him, he has definitely had a very positive role. Definitely has been very, very supportive of the Cambodia and the Cambodians in Sri Lanka. On the other hand, I know that he's a political monk and he represents a certain kind of political posture, and so that the fact that the Cambodian monks seem to almost all have at this point, or the last time I was there was several years ago, are in some ways under his umbrella. And that has implications as well for what does it mean for Cambodian monks to be studied in Sri Lanka? And does it have political implications? Or when the Cambodian monks return to Cambodia, will they be, they're leaving Sri Lankan politics behind? It may have no effect on them at all, but these are questions one might ask.
Like you sort of think of the Asian Foundation with, they're gonna learn too much communism, cut their scholarships, you know?
Right, I mean,
Yeah.
the Cambodian monks in the 1950s they were receiving these scholarships from these Cambodian associations, the Friends of the Pali School, or the Cambodian World Branch of World Fellowship of Buddhists, but they were not, perhaps not even aware that the money came from the Asia Foundation, or if they were, they weren't thinking of that having political implications. And yet, even something seemingly as innocuous as getting a scholarship to study Buddhism or study, it ends up having some political implications.
Visit some.
Oh, okay. I see that Bisset San has his hand raised. We'd
Okay.
like to hear you.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for this course. I really enjoyed it, and it's so exciting. And I myself have never been to Sri Lanka or India or Nepal, even though I've been as a Buddhist monk for almost 20 years. But for some reason, I never got a chance to go to that place. And but I have a lot of friends, not a lot, but many of my friends who've been to India for a pilgrimage reason or for education reason. But regarding the political implication for, I mean, after the Khmer Rouge, especially concerning with concerning the Buddhist Cambodian Buddhist monks studying in Sri Lanka, I from my own perspective or my own views, I might be wrong, but there seem no political implication impact on Khmer Buddhist monk studying in Sri Lanka, because the relationship between the Cambodia and Sri Lanka is like mostly based on religion or Buddhism, not concerning the politics at all. This is from what I can understand. But in the case of Indian from the past, I think you might be right in terms of political implication. But in the recent time, as I said, I might be wrong, but I hardly see anyone who has a political implication.
Actually, I agree with you in that the monks or former monks who I've had contact with who studied in Sri Lanka and then returned to Cambodia, I don't see any evidence that it's affected them politically. So
That is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
the question is whether because and I apologize if not everyone agrees with this term. I would say there's a lot of Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka, and the question is whether any of the monks who studied in Sri Lanka would have a similar Buddhist nationalism once they return to Cambodia. I don't see that, but that's the question.
I think most of Cambodian Buddhist monks who went to study Buddhism in Sri Lanka, when they come back, mostly they end up being as a group of Buddhist monks who are affiliated to the ruling parties. So they seem less vocal in terms of politics, if I understand it correctly. And so most of them has like affiliation with the high-ranking politician in Cambodia, and they might end up getting some position in the government, and so they seem less.
I don't
politics.
see, as far as I know, none of them have been controversial figures.
That's true. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
That's all from me.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, it's getting late, and I did not remember to have a break, and so I think we'll end. And again, thank you so much for those of you who are here in person and those of you who participated by video. Akbardin, I hope I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Angela Mormsabon, who's been quiet, but I know you're there. And I remember you from India and Piset San. So thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you so much for your
Yes. So,
Let's thank the
insightful lecture.
and yes, with thanks to DEARI, the Dhammachai Association Research Institute. What is the correct acronym?
International Research
The
Institute.
Dhammachai
Dhammachai
International Research Institute, which is
sponsored Professor John to come here,
up
so.
here, and I'm
we're
very grateful for that. And I'm, as I say, there's been a series of very prominent Buddhist scholars who've come here several years in a row, and I'm very humbled to be one of the people who was invited here. So among these other distinguished scholars who came here previously. Okay. Thank you very much. And so I will try to figure out how to leave.